Monster Hunter Stories has been remade and it's now available on modern systems with improved graphics, voice acting, gameplay and a lot more. But I can imagine it's been a while since some players have actually dove into Monster Hunter Stories. So with that, I'm Darcblade with a refresher guide to Monster Hunter Stories. In this video, I'm going to be bringing you 15 tips to get you back up to speed with how the game plays, or answer little questions you may have. Now, this is clearly a beginner's guide and a refresher guide, rather than a guide for someone who is an expert when it comes to the Monster Hunter Stories franchise. Nonetheless, whether you're an expert or beginner, I hope this helps. Now, the first tip I can give you is to understand how battles work. At its core, Monster Hunter Stories is a rock, paper, scissors game. You can choose between certain attacks or skills that are linked to either power attacks, which are red, speed attacks, which are blue, or technical attacks, which are green. Power beats technical, technical beats speed, and speed beats power. Or if you want it in Pokemon terms, red burns green, green soaks up blue, and blue extinguishes red. Certain monsters are more attuned to using a specific attack type. So for example, Rathian is classed as a speed monster, thus it tends to use speed attacks more than the others. It doesn't always use speed attacks, but it's just more inclined to use speed attacks. Which brings us on to tip number 2, which is understanding the Kinship gauge. The Kinship gauge, found on your Kinship stone at the bottom of the screen, fills up as you perform certain attacks that best the monster you're fighting. This shows how in sync you are with your own monster. Basically, performing attacks that correctly counter the monster you're fighting, so you're winning the rock, paper, scissors, will allow this gauge to fill up, which can be done even more quickly should you perform certain double attacks or button mashing events, to which when it is full, you'll be able to ride your monster. However, this Kinship gauge is also a resource that you can spend on skills if it's more beneficial to use those skills than ride your monster. Which brings us on to tip number 3, which is kind of linked to what we just talked about, which is double attacks. Now, double attacks are when you and your monster, when it's not mounted, perform the same type of attack against a monster that overwrites that monster's attack. So say both you and your monster perform a power attack and the monster you're fighting performs a technical attack, both of you beat it, you'll perform a double attack, in which the double attack will actually cancel out the monster's attack for that round. So it's a good way to take down monsters without actually taking damage yourself. However, there is an aspect of luck involved in this. Which brings us on to tip number 4, which is Kinship attacks. Now, when you're mounted on your monster, you'll be able to fight as one, but more importantly, you'll be able to perform a Kinship attack. These are flashy finisher moves that deal a lot of damage. However, take notice of your Kinship stone at the bottom of the screen, as this can go from level 1 to 3. Keep attacking the monster, countering it with the right attacks, and eventually it will get to level 3, allowing your Kinship attack to deal the most damage it can. Which brings us on to tip number 5, which is changing the speed of battle. Up in the top left, by pressing back or select, if you're on controller, you can speed the battle up to 3 times. This helps when you're farming, as battles and some of the animations can take a little while. Which brings us on to tip number 6, which is when you're facing monsters for the first time, as in you haven't encountered them before yet, you won't be able to see their health bar, or how much damage you've done to them. You can gain some information by using binoculars, which are items you have in your pouch, or using certain monster skills. But after you've faced a monster once, you will always be able to see its health bar in further battles. Which brings us on to tip number 7, which is during combat you can actually switch out your monster. So you're not always stuck using the same monster. If one of your monsters is a wrong matchup or is severely wounded, you can switch to a healthier one if you need to. Which in turn also, when you're looking at which monster to switch to, there's a little egg meter which shows how close they are to performing their Kinship attack. Which brings us on to tip number 8, which is when you're exploring the world and completed optional quests. Some of these optional quests will contain skill scrolls. These allow you to expand your moveset with the various hunter weapons you have in your arsenal. So try to prioritize these, as more skills for your weapons allow for more options when it comes to battle. Which brings us on to tip number 9, which is kind of related to skill scrolls, which is that certain optional quests will also give you the ability to craft and combine items into stronger items, for example, mega potions. So when you get one of these optional quests that give you a book to expand your combine list, maybe consider prioritizing this. Next is tip number 10, which is monsters have world skills, as in they have skills that they can perform whilst you're exploring the open world. These include certain radar skills where you can find honey, or bugs, or mushrooms, or other monsters. Some of them have jumping skills, which are very useful, being able to break rocks, climb ivy, fly, so on and so forth. So keep an eye on what world skills your monsters have. Next up is tip number 11, which is when you're out exploring the world, keep an eye out for oddly coloured monster dens. Monster dens are where you get new eggs that you can hatch, but some of these dens come in different colours, like golden dens, which are rarer dens containing monsters that have better stats, or just rarer monsters in general. So always try to prioritise these if you find them. Now for tip number 12, which is when you're actually in a den, when you get to the egg nest and you're rummaging through to pick up an egg, remember you can do this multiple times. You don't have to stick with the first egg you get. Also take note of what Naviru says in terms of the smell of the egg and the weight of the egg. Normally the more smellier it is and the heavier it is, the better it is. Which brings us on to tip number 13, which is paintballs. Now, if you find a specific monster out in the wild, not in a den, but out in the wild, but you want to capture one, you can use paintballs. These are items that could be bought or made. Throw a paintball when a monster is close to death, and instead of fainting, it will run away at the end of battle. It will then spawn a monster den, to which the monster will be asleep in there, but the nest it's sleeping on will guarantee to contain a monster of that type. So keep that in mind. As for tip number 14, which is the Rite of Channeling. Now the Rite of Channeling is where things get a little bit more complex, and this is probably where most of the endgame and builds will come into play. The Rite of Channeling allows you to mess around with monster genes and teach skills to monsters that they might not otherwise know. For example, teaching Lagambi, a ice-based monster, a fire attack. The game does do a decent job at teaching you this, and to be honest it could use its own separate guide, but nonetheless, this is a quick tip to remind you that it does exist and to keep it in mind. This is also the main reason why you might want to keep duplicates of certain monsters as well. And finally, tip number 15, which is a simple one, which is if you get stuck in the game and you don't know what to do next, then simply press the back or select buttons and it will give you a prompt from Naviru on what to do next in terms of the story. And with that, these have been 15 quick refresher tips to Monster Hunter Stories. Of course, there is a lot more information and a lot more detail you can go into, but like I said, this video is aimed at just giving you a little bit of a refresher course to Monster Hunter Stories if you're diving into it. So I hope it helps, and I hope you enjoy the remaster of the game if you're picking it up, and until next time, I've been Darcblade. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.